People arrived to North America by crossing the Bering Land Bridge and residing in independent tribes. The most significant civilizations were Mayans in Central, Incas in South, Aztecs in Mexico, and Mound Builders in Ohio. A few important people you need to know are: Leif Erikson. He was a Viking explorer who discovered Greenland and northern Canada. Christopher Columbus. He was an Italian explorer sponsored by Spain to find a shorter route to East Asia. While he was doing that, he accidentally discovered the New World. Ponce de Leon. He discovered the Fountain of Youth in Florida. Pizarro, who conquered the Incan Empire. And Cortez, who conquered the Aztec Empire. Once the Europeans discovered the New World, it was divided by the Pope in 1494 by the Treaty of Tordesillas. The treaty gave Spain control of everything except Brazil, which Portugal received. Since Spain got most control of the New World, it implemented the encomienda system. The encomienda system was used during the Spanish colonization of the Americas, whereby conquistadors were granted the towns of the native people they conquered. The conquistadors taxed these native people and used them for free labor in exchange for agreeing to provide safety to them through an established military and teaching them Christianity. That's all for pre-colonial America. Moving on to colonial America, the first important colony to know is Jamestown in Virginia. Jamestown was the first successful colony. Prior to Jamestown there was something called Roanoke Island, which is now known as the last colony. Roanoke Island did not survive, which is why it's called the Lost Colony, since nobody knows what happened to it. Jamestown is the first colony. Jamestown would have shared the same fate as Roanoke if it wasn't for John Smith's strict laws, which provided the discipline the colonists needed to survive. An example of his strict laws was no work equals no food. Additionally, John Rolfe discovered how to plant tobacco, which became the main cash crop and an important component leading to Virginia's success. Last thing you want to remember related to Jamestown is the House of Burgesses of 1619, which was a committee formed to resolve local issues. This is important because it's the first form of representative government in North America. Next, we have Massachusetts. Before getting off the ship, the Pilgrims decided to sign the Mayflower Compact, which was a set of laws they all decided to agree on. The Mayflower Compact is important because it details the set of rules the Pilgrims had to obey, thus it set the standard for the Constitution we have today. John Winthrop was elected governor for about 20 years and helped Massachusetts establish itself. Puritans held strong religious beliefs in Massachusetts, and anyone that went against Puritan beliefs was exiled. There ended up being a lot of people that were exiled by Puritans in Massachusetts. One of them being the Quakers. Since the Puritans banned the Quakers from Massachusetts, they settled in Pennsylvania. Anne Hutchinson was also exiled from Massachusetts. She espoused antinomianism, which is the belief that holy life couldn't guarantee salvation and those who were truly saved didn't have to obey the laws of man or God. This obviously didn't go over too well with the Puritans, so she was banished from Massachusetts and ended up going to Rhode Island. Similar to Anne Hutchinson was Roger Williams, who was also banished to Rhode Island. He was a clergyman who urged people to make a break from the Church of England and denied civil government the right to govern religious behavior. Because all these outcasts decided to go to Rhode Island was referred to as the sewer because all these people who were banished from other colonies ended up settling there. Maryland is another important colony. Lord Baltimore wanted to make Maryland a haven for Catholics. The Act of Toleration guaranteed religious toleration to all Christians. While it provided religious freedom for Christians, it called for death on anyone who didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. So, it was only a haven for Catholics, and the Act of Toleration wasn't truly tolerate of any other religious beliefs. The Carolinas were established by squatters. Squatters are people who go and settle down without really owning the land. Rice was the cash crop for the Carolinas, just like tobacco was for Virginia. Slaves were best suited to work on plantations to cultivate rice because they were familiar with rice cultivation techniques frequently used in Africa, and they were also resistant to malaria, which was rampant in the Carolinas. The last important colony to mention is Georgia. Georgia was founded by James Oglethorpe. Georgia's main purpose was to act as a buffer colony. It buffered British colonies against Spanish settlements in Florida and French settlements in Louisiana. Another main purpose of Georgia was that it was a holding location for all debtors. Its nickname was actually Debtors' Prison. Now that we have a feel for all the colonies, let's discuss colonial life. In the South and Chesapeake regions, the average age expectancy was around 40 years old due to the harsh living conditions. Life was centered around business, specifically the production of cash crops like tobacco and rice. Religion was not important, and business was top priority in the Chesapeake. Most of the population in the Chesapeake were indentured servants, which basically meant they were destitute, young, unskilled, European men who dedicated 7 years of their lives working on plantations for free. In exchange they got transportation to the New World, food, clothing, lodging, and other necessities. The head right system is important because it allowed an aristocrat to sponsor an indentured servant's passage to America. Sponsoring an indentured servant gave aristocrats the right to buy 50 acres of land for a cheap price. But by giving land to masters, the indentured servants had a very little chance to buy their own land, keeping the colonials poor, which eventually led to strife between poor servants and wealthy landowners. Many of the indentured servants who completed their years of service were incapable of advancing independently, and many simply became farmers to make ends meet. Bacon's Rebellion is important. It happened in 1676 and was led by Nathaniel Bacon in the Virginia colony. Bacon became mad with Native Americans in Virginia and Governor Berkeley's friendly policy towards them. So, he took it upon himself to drive the Native Americans out of Virginia, while burning down the Capitol and forcing Governor Berkeley to flee to England. Many indentured servants participated in the rebellion. Now, this rebellion is important because it is the very first rebellion in American history, and it showed one of the first revolts against the law in America. Bacon's rebellion really showed how weak colonial government was back. Once indentured servants realized their dull prospects of living in America, the word quickly spread back to Europe and led to a decline in indentured servants. The decline in indentured servants made the Chesapeake colonies rely on slaves to work the plantations. The decline of indentured servants is what led to the huge burst of slavery, especially in the South. Also, aristocrats began to distrust indentured servants after they participated in Bacon's rebellion and sought a more reliable, controllable labor source, which also led to the growth of the slave trade. Now let's discuss New England. Average life expectancy here was about 70, which is about double from that of the South. New England's geography didn't favor cultivation of cash crops, so they favored industry and trading. Also, in contrast to the South, many people who came to New England came as families as opposed to as indentured servants. In addition to the family-oriented demographic, religion was also a big part of New England, unlike the South. Original Puritans were very religious and were worried their future generations will be distant from religion, so they started jeremiads, which were lectures preachers gave to make people feel guilty about not being religiously strict. Another thing they did to boost religious fervor was the Halfway Covenant. It was made to increase declining church membership. The Halfway Covenant reduced qualifications required to be members of the church and allowed for partial membership in an attempt to reinvigorate religious zeal. The First Great Awakening of 1730s was also a product of the decline in religion amongst New Englanders. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield instilled fear in people's hearts across New England. Edwards preached Calvinism, which is predestination, and Whitefield preached evangelism. Great schisms appeared in the churches between the old lights who thought that salvation was predestined, and the new lights who thought a person could be saved through conversion. The sermons of revivalist preachers proposed new thoughts on church doctrine and were filled with messages of personal connections to God. As such, many of the established churches of the colonies were not welcoming to the revivalists, forcing these preachers to take their messages outside, holding open-air sermons. In 1690, the Salem witch trials took place, where girls accused people of being witches out of boredom. About 20 people were executed. Education was highly valued in New England while disregarded in the South. Although highly valued, it still was focused heavily on religion and not on academics like present-day education. Now, let's tie up a few loose ends to wrap up colonial America before moving on to the American Revolution. The Triangle Trade is important because it occurred between colonies, England and Africa. From the colonies, natural resources like indigo, rice, and tobacco were sent to England. From England, weapons and textiles were sent to Africa. And from Africa, slaves were sent to the Indies and the colonies. Important literature during colonial America is Poor Richard's Almanac by Ben Franklin, which included common phrases and altruisms in English language. Lastly, we have the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, which was a battle between French and Indians who came together to fight Britain. After the French and Indian War, Britain acquired what is now the Ohio Valley, land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. This area was still home to many French settlers, as well as a vast Indian reserve. The Proclamation of 1763 ended the 7 Years' War, declaring settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains illegal for colonists. The Proclamation of 1763 was important because of the effect it had on the relationship between Britain and the colonies. The colonists felt betrayed by the proclamation, as they had just shed blood during the French and Indian War to help Britain acquire these lands, and now they were being told that they weren't allowed to settle into the land. Colonists saw the Proclamation of 1763 as a form of oppression and restraint, one of the many factors leading to the American Revolution. When the French and Indian War was over, Britain won and found itself in massive debt. so it decided to tax the colonies to make up the debt from the 7 Years' War. These taxes are another factor leading to the American Revolution, which we'll discuss in the next video. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.